What would happen if a white man desired a black woman's slave, or perhaps her young daughter, who was also enslaved? Or what about his wife, the white mistress who held power over the enslaved and often visited plantations, becoming captivated by the strong black men working there? The result was mixed-race children, whose futures were uncertain. Yet these forbidden desires didn't end there. Often the young sons of slaveholding families, without a thought for consent, would use force against black women and girls to exert their power. Records exist of these instances where white men, white women, and white boys abused enslaved people for their pleasure. However, these accounts have been suppressed, and this topic is rarely taught in schools. This is not only because it would cause white people embarrassment, but also guilt. So what untold abuses were inflicted upon black slaves that could shock anyone today? In this video, let's uncover this hidden history. The sexual exploitation of enslaved people wasn't merely an incidental aspect of slavery. It was a core mechanism of control and power for slaveholders. It was a tool used to assert dominance, relegate the enslaved to a subordinate status, and, disturbingly, generate economic profit. The sexual abuse of enslaved black women in particular was systemic and pervasive. It wasn't about desire, it was a weapon used to dehumanize them, stripping them of any sense of autonomy. For white men in positions of power, exploiting enslaved women reinforced their societal dominance and allowed them to control every facet of the enslaved people's lives. The children born from this exploitation represented an economic boon for slaveholders. Under the legal principle of partus sequitur ventrum, a child's status followed that of the mother. This meant children born to enslaved women, even those fathered by white masters, were born into slavery. These mixed-race children, often called mulattoes, in historical texts, increased the enslavers' wealth by expanding their enslaved labor force. This perverse system tragically turned rape into an economic strategy, where children born from these violent encounters became human property, further enriching the enslavers. When white wives observed mixed-race children working on the plantations, they understood what had transpired, and they, too, had their own ways of retaliating. In states like Virginia, sexual violence was rampant, contributing to one of the largest populations of mixed-race enslaved people. By 1850, Virginia had 44,000 mixed-race individuals, a direct consequence of the widespread rape of enslaved women. While some mixed-race individuals might have experienced slightly better treatment due to their lighter skin, their status as enslaved remained unchanged, and their existence served as a stark reminder of the brutal system of exploitation. This is when white women would often decide to make their own moves. Less discussed, but equally significant, is the sexual exploitation of enslaved black men. They were often forced into sexual relations for the purpose of breeding more enslaved children. This practice reduced men to mere studs, stripping them of their humanity and agency. Enslavers sometimes deliberately arranged these coerced unions to increase their enslaved labor force. In other instances, black men were sexually humiliated as punishment or subjected to assaults by white men or women as a display of dominance. It's important to understand that rape laws existed, but they generally protected only white women. There was no legal recognition of rape for enslaved black women or men. For instance, in 1859, the Mississippi Supreme Court ruled that an enslaved black man couldn't be convicted of raping an enslaved black woman because the crime of rape applied only to assaults against white women. This legal loophole left enslaved women and men vulnerable to constant sexual violence without recourse or protection. Books like Soul by Soul by Walter Johnson and The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptist examine how the sexual economy was embedded in slavery. Baptist highlights how the cotton boom in the early 19th century fueled increased demand for both labor and reproduction, with many enslavers systematically forcing enslaved women to reproduce to maintain a steady labor supply. This practice, often termed slave breeding, became a means of maximizing economic gain while further dehumanizing the enslaved. In some cases, this exploitation was generational. An 1826 case involving two University of Virginia students who abused a 16-year-old enslaved black girl exemplifies this. After contracting a venereal disease from her, they stripped her naked and beat her. This incident demonstrates how enslaved women were treated as disposable, their bodies used and discarded at the whims of white men. Another incident occurred in 1787 in Maryland, where an enslaved black man was forced at gunpoint by two white men to sexually abuse a free black woman. The trauma of such events, compounded by the powerlessness to fight back, illustrates the extensive control enslavers wielded over the lives of both enslaved men and women. Resistance to sexual exploitation often resulted in severe punishment. Those who fought back faced whippings, separation from their families, or being sold to the lower South, where conditions were even more brutal. Separation from loved ones was a common tactic used by enslavers to break the spirit of those who resisted. A particularly devastating case in Missouri in 1855 involved a young enslaved woman named Celia, who was repeatedly raped by her white enslaver. After enduring years of abuse, Celia eventually killed him in self-defense. However, the courts refused to acknowledge her right to self-defense, concluding that enslaved black women had no legal right to resist the sexual advances of their owners. Celia was convicted of murder and hanged. This case highlights how the legal system denied enslaved women the most basic human rights. Even after slavery's abolition, the abuse of black people persisted. In May 1870, a horrific racial nightmare unfolded in North Carolina. A black woman was raped by 15 white men, and her husband was lynched by the same mob days later. In the same community, another black woman was brutally assaulted, raped by a mob of white men, and stabbed multiple times. Even after emancipation, the legal system continued to treat the sexual assault of black women differently from that of white women. The Georgia Code of 1861 established mandatory sentences for the rape of white women, but left the punishment for the rape of black women to the discretion of the courts. In October 1866, a Freedmen's Bureau agent issued arrest warrants for two white men accused of beating a black woman named Sylvie Sohn and killing her son. However, the local sheriff in Louisiana refused to arrest the men, illustrating the failure of law enforcement to protect black women. Similarly, in September 1866, Roa Ann Childs was targeted in her home by 8 white planters in Georgia. Initially seeking her husband, they kidnapped and sexually assaulted Mrs. Childs when they learned she was alone. According to her affidavit, one man held a gun to her head while another abused her. A former Confederate soldier then raped her, and the mob robbed her home and beat her daughter. Justice was never served. Faced with limited options, many enslaved women submitted to the sexual demands of their enslavers as a means of survival. Refusal often meant severe punishment or being sold away. Some women made peace with their situation, hoping to secure better treatment for themselves and their children. For example, Harriet Jacobs entered into a long-term relationship with a neighboring white man to avoid the advances of her enslaver, choosing the lesser of two evils in a system where she had no bodily autonomy. For many women, sexual submission offered a grim path to marginally improved living conditions, such as working as domestic servants instead of in the fields. While this might have afforded them slightly better treatment, it didn't erase the inherent exploitation and dehumanization. At slave auctions, enslaved women were paraded with their bodies exposed, often stripped naked, to advertise their ability to bear children, highlighting their reproductive value. This practice further dehumanized them, reducing them to their potential as breeders. The reproductive capacity of enslaved women was often compared to livestock breeding. James H. Goggin of Brunswick County, Virginia, argued during an 1832 debate that enslavers had a right to the increase of their enslaved women, comparing it to a horse owner's right to the offspring of brood mares. This comparison reduced human beings to mere economic assets. Thomas Jefferson Randolph noted in the same debate that 8,500 enslaved people were exported annually from Virginia to the Deep South. This internal slave trade became a booming industry, further commodifying Black bodies as enslavers profited from the breeding of their enslaved workforce. Enslavers used various methods to encourage enslaved women to bear children, ranging from small incentives to outright coercion. Were you taught about this in school, college, or university? Isn't it true that this topic is rarely discussed to avoid Black people asking questions and to prevent white people from feeling shame? In the comments section below, let us know. Is it wrong to tell the young Black generation about what happened during slavery? Or should they know the reality of their ancestors' experiences? Would you like us to make more videos? If so, please support us by subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell icon. You can check out more videos on our channel too.